Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to January and November. My name is Eric Yankee. I'm the Dean of the College of Letters and Science, and what this actually is our community lecture series, and so we're very excited to have you come out on this cold night to hear from our program. And we have copies of the program what we do throughout the year, so check them out. They're free and they're always down here in the Pioneer room, so glad to see you come here. The weather changes, you know, so it can be nicer than some nights. Our two speakers tonight are Dr. Tangedal and Dr. Sara behind me here. And the project that you'll be learning about, I'll kind of get into quite a bit for you, is really looking at the situation, 100 years ago, or roughly a little more than 100 years ago now that we're after the Armistice Day from 1918. But the whole sort of tensions around German immigrants in the United States at a time of war. And I'll let them kind of carry from there. But what's really fun about having both Ross and Sara here is their collaborative work on the book. And I'll be talking quite a bit about John Herrmann and the whole project that they've been involved in. And I think what's also really neat is both of them went to grad school at Kent State, right? Kent State folk. And they've been collaborating works, everything from sort of editorial work on books like this, as well as work in the Hemingway projects, various and sundry. And so they're really great kind of literary group for us to have around on campus. And I'd like to add too that Dr. Ross Tangedal here is our director for Cornerstone Press. I'm sure he'll tell you a little more about what Cornerstone does, but I'll let them take it from there. Thank you.
Yeah, I will make that.
Well, thank you. So the way this is going to work is Dr. Kosiba and I are going to go back and forth a bit. We each have sort of chunks of the presentation that we've worked on. It's been a fascinating project, to say the least, and I'll talk a little bit about that process, how the idea came to be. Dr. Kosiba will do the same, and then we'll kind of come together at the end. So here we are. Well, I'm going to start with some thank yous. I think that's appropriate, given that this project had a lot of assistance in a lot of different ways. So tonight, I, along with my colleague and friend, Sara Kosiba, will discuss our roles in publishing John Herrmann's Foreign Born. So here it is, fresh, hot off the press. A book written by a German American about German Americans at the homefront in Michigan during the Great War. So Dr. Kosiba is the expert on John Herrmann's life and work, and she is currently developing a biography on the writer. And together we were part of a true story of literary excavation. And now the book can make its way into the world, thankfully. It took a long time. So I'd like to thank the following for their support during the project's lifespan. So Dean Eric Yankee and Associate Dean Todd Good of the College of Letters and Science. The Department of English, especially Chair Rebecca Stevens and outgoing Chair Dr. Michael Williams. Tobias Barsky of the Department of World Languages and Literatures. A month ago, I was able to give a shorter talk at the German immigration exhibit that was going on. Some of you may have gone and checked that out at the Noel Fine Arts Center. I was lucky to be part of that program. Tobias was a big part of that. The Society for the Study of Midwestern Literature, which Sara and I kind of consider our societal home, you might say. Patricia Oman at Hastings College Press, the director of the press that put out the book. I'm a true champion of Midwestern literature and regional writing. And my wife, CJ, who's at home with our 2-year-old, who deals with my many research projects that I take on with such grace and understanding. And I always come home with a new project. She goes, well, good, you should probably work on that. And so she's always encouraging my work, and I really appreciate that. And I also have to thank our almost 2-year-old Adeline, who was my co-editor of the book, honestly, in the summer of 17. She'd sit on my lap. She was about 9 months old or so, and she'd sit on my lap, and I had 2 computers open, and I'd be working back and forth. And it was the morning, so my wife was getting ready for work, and I had to watch my child, and she sat on my lap while I edited. So she's a big part of Foreign Born. She's going to be a good editor someday. And finally, I'd like to thank Sara. She knows what she means to me. She brought me along on this fascinating textual journey, and she didn't have to. She could have handled this potentially on her own, but she said, no, let's bring Ross along and see how it works. I think it's worked fairly well. She's always encouraged me to study Midwestern literatures too. I kind of cut my teeth at Kent State as a Hemingway and Fitzgerald scholar, but Sara's always promoted the Midwest in a larger context, and so because of that, I've been able to study more writers like John Herrmann. So I'm grateful for our friendship. So now, To really kick off the presentation, Dr. Kosiba is going to give us quite a bit of context and history on Herrmann himself, and she'll get us going in that regard. So, my friend and colleague, Dr. Sara, thank you.
Thanks to Ross for that, and for inviting me to come and be part of this. If any of you have ever sort of gotten very, very interested in a particular project or a research sort of thing, family history, anything along those lines, you know that quite often you can get tunnel vision very easily and sort of become obsessed with your subject. And I'm a little obsessed with John Herrmann, so I'm going to try to keep it somewhere between interesting for you and not putting you to sleep. One other thing I want to say briefly is it's also a pleasure to be here because I'm a graduate of UWSP. So go Pointers. And I really have to say that the English department here was a big part of why I do the work that I do. So when I was taking classes here, it's a really weird, obscure story to tell people, but one of the very popular classes in the English department at the time was a class in vampires and literature taught by Ruth Dorgan. And everybody wanted to get into that class just because, I mean, if you had to take a literature class, why not take one on vampires? But in that sort of unlikely setting, I was introduced to August Derleth, a pretty prominent Wisconsin writer, which when I went off to do my master's degree, I did my thesis on August Derleth, because at the time when I heard that reference in Ruth Dorgan's class, I didn't know any Wisconsin writers. So I started saying, well, why haven't I heard of this guy? And I researched his life and his career, and then that led to why aren't Midwestern writers talked about more? And so that led on to my PhD work and my dissertation on Midwestern writers from the 20s and 30s. So in many ways, my work on John Herrmann was sort of born here. So it's definitely nice to be back and part of that. So a little bit about John Herrmann. He was born in Lansing, Michigan, November 9th, 1900. His family was long established in Lansing, as his grandfather, who's also named John Theodore Herrmann, John Herrmann was named after him, had immigrated from Germany in the late 19th century and established a prosperous tailoring firm there, one that was eventually taken over by John's father and his brothers. And so they were incredibly well known in Lansing. The firm ended up there for over 50 years. So the family was well established in the community. John was not exactly the sort of most industrious son, and he was a little bit strange, the strange one in the family, because he went away after he finished high school. He went away, he tried being a lawyer. He went to law school for about a year. That didn't stick. Then he went to the University of Michigan for a couple of years. That didn't exactly stick. And his family actually funded him to go and hang out in Europe for 2 years, ostensibly to study. Although the only actual sort of attendance I can find at a European university is a summer at the University of Munich. But in 1924, the part that becomes of most interest to me and to perhaps many of you is that in 1924, in about April, he's in Paris. And he happens to hang out in the same cafes as people like Ernest Hemingway, Nathan Ashe, William Carlos Williams, Robert McAlmon, and many, many names that we now know as members of the Lost Generation. So that famous group of writers in the 1920s. It's clear that that moment is inspiring to him because in that summer of 1924, he goes off to the coast of France for several months and he writes his first novel, What Happens? Which Ross actually left me a copy up here to hold up, which we just got published in 2015. And it has an interesting backstory as well. That was actually the first project that I started on with John Herrmann. Because when I was working on my dissertation on Midwestern writers in the 1920s and 1930s, I came across a reference to the fact that that was a banned book. And there's nothing that entertains me more than the idea of what aren't they letting people read? So I'm like, I gotta find this thing. And it proved to be a little bit difficult to find. We don't have exact numbers, but perhaps roughly 300 copies were printed. And the number one issue it had is it was printed in France. When copies of it were shipped to the United States in a very notable obscenity trial, they were seized by US Customs under charges of obscenity, because at the time it was a sort of problematic climate for anything going through the mail. A lot of periodicals had been getting stopped sometimes for actually sending obscene things, but people were sort of hypersensitive to it. And customs officials were particularly suspicious of anything coming from places like France because they didn't seem to have the same propriety as we had here. So it's seized by US Customs, a package of his books, and it ends up going to trial in New York. And the lawyer that represents him ended up becoming rather famous because his name was Morris Ernst, and he ended up working for the ACLU for 25 years. What happens was his first obscenity trial for a literary work. And he went on to write a book about it, and it just becomes sort of a pivotal moment in sort of that area of literary history. Other than that, though, John Herrmann's sort of literary star never rose that high for a number of reasons. One, he was often poor. If you go through a lot of his letters at the time, he had to take, real people jobs and go work for a while and try to save up money. He ended up marrying a woman named Josephine Herbst, who was actually a more famous writer, and quite often he let her do the writing, and he went and took the jobs so that they could stay sort of flush with cash. He would still dabble in some things. You see the copy of What Happens there at the top. That was the wrapper for the first printing of it. His second book, Summer Is Ended, came out in 1932. The same year, he tied with Thomas Wolfe for the Scribner's Short Novel Prize, probably his highest moment of literary greatness. In 32, it was a $10,000 prize. He split it, so he got $5,000. I think that's probably the most he ever made from his writing. And then in 1939, he wrote a novel titled The Salesman. There's also some short stories sprinkled throughout these years, published in various periodicals of the time, particularly the little magazines, the artier pieces. He has since, in years, more recent years, he's less known for his writing. In fact, there's no known biography of him, part of why I'm working on one. And he only gets sort of tangential references in some of the biographies of his more famous literary friends. He's in the Hemingway Letters collections, if you're a Hemingway fan. He is in biographies of John Dos Passos, but briefly. He's in the biographies of William Carlos Williams, but briefly. But what he's become more well known for is his communist activities in the 1930s. In particular, he's alleged to have introduced Whittaker Chambers to Alger Hiss, if you know your communist espionage history. I am starting to dispute that, but it's what he's famous for. So he's involved in communist causes in the 30s. In the 1940s, he joins the US Coast Guard and serves in World War II. By the 1950s, late 40s, early 50s, as the FBI starts investigating more communist activity and people who knew other people, he runs away to Mexico to avoid sort of that investigation. While he's there, he's present. He doesn't witness the event, but he's there the day that William S. Burroughs, the notable beat writer, shot his wife in a William Tell-style accident. There's evidence that he's interviewed by the police that day, and suggestions that he was having an affair with Burroughs' wife, although that's unsubstantiated. And ultimately, in the late 50s, his health becomes poor and he dies in Mexico in 1959. So he's sort of a fascinating figure for being there for some of these key moments of literary history, for having sort of these fantastic friendships. He goes fishing with Hemingway, and there's all these great moments, sailing with John Dos Passos, involved in all of this sort of communist activity with a lot of people who are really key to sort of that storyline. And even in the 1950s, between William S. Burroughs and other writers and poets who are in Mexico, he's running into them and he's talking to them. And so he's got this full, rich life that's just sort of fascinating to study. I mentioned a little bit about What Happens, which is initially what drove me to the University of Texas at Austin to do some research on him. The Harry Ransom Center there is one of two places in the country that has the majority of John Herrmann's papers, or the majority of what's still existing. The Beinecke Library at Yale is the other site. But I went down to Texas, ideally because we were talking about publishing What Happens, and I knew that there was material down there and I needed to know what it could tell me about the novel. The Ransom Center also has the Morris Ernst papers, so I could get stuff from the trial as well. While I was there and I'm going through all the material, I come across what is clearly a relatively complete novel titled Foreign Born. I didn't know that that's what I was going to find, because if any of you have ever done archival research, sometimes you look at a finding aid and they'll say, well, there's 200 pages of something, but you don't know what 200 pages is. Sometimes it's one line on one page and a paragraph on the next, and maybe it's nothing. So I find this typescript and I photograph all the material, because thankfully archives let you do that now, and I say, okay, I'm going to look at this when I finish What Happens, which is what I did. And I start reading the novel and I find it really fascinating. I know from sort of the contextual research around it that, like I said, he wrote it. So basically, he writes what happens in 1924. He comes back to the US, and he can't place the novel with any New York publishers, so he's frustrated. He comes home to Lansing, Michigan, where his parents keep saying, "Isn't it about time you get a job?" And he is really frustrated because he's going to be a writer. So he gets a position at a bookstore in Detroit, and right before he leaves to take that position in January of 1925, he writes to Josephine Herbst, who he's dating at the time. And he says he's about to start, and I'm going to read a little bit of a long passage here from a letter. He's going to start, quote, "a book about a German American during the war, which I hope to work on there and possibly finish off. He started out 100% with son and wife of English descent. He is respected in the community and a Rotarian. The war makes him pro-German, his wife and son against him. Family breaks up almost. Business goes bum. He must resign from the Rotarians. Son goes to war, open break between the father and son. Father must buy Liberty bonds, refused, has trouble with Security League, starts buying bonds and using them in his business. People think he has become patriotic. He still talks pro-German stuff, though. End of war, son back, business fine, making much money. Rotarian take him back." And the book ends with a speech he is making before the Rotarians on 100% Americanism. How does that sound roughly? That's the end of the quote. I just realized I skipped a slide. This is what he would have looked like about the time he was writing this novel. So the novel unfolds largely as his letter to Josephine Herbst describes. And so as I start reading the novel and I start looking for references to it in these letters and I find where he starts writing about it, I start realizing that there's something really interesting here, because not only is he working on this sort of fascinating topic in terms of World War I anti-German sentiments, but he's also doing this at the same time he's being rather experimental with what he's doing and what happens. And it becomes sort of this interesting intersection of both sort of style and subject matter in a way that I thought other people might be interested in as well. And so with that, I'm going to kick it off to Ross, who's going to talk a little bit about what we did once we decided we were going to put this into print.
Okay. So, Sara knows pretty much everything about John Herrmann and Foreign Born. And I didn't. And so when she approached me and said, "Hey, I need someone to help edit this," I felt that my contribution for this presentation should focus on this idea of editing. That editing is multivalent, it's multifaceted, it has a lot going with it. It's not as simple as it seems. We think of editing as like, oh, I'm going to edit a friend's paper, I'll fix the grammar and put a few periods in the right spots, and I'm an editor. Well, in a way, you're editing. But there are so many different levels to what editing is. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that as it pertains to this extremely complex textual document and what we can do with it moving forward. So when we read, we think of books as outgrowths of authorial inspiration. A writer has an idea, that idea is written down on pieces of paper, those papers are transformed into a book, that book is published for readers to read. While this sounds ideal, it is illogical, and frankly, it does a disservice to the process and business of literature. In reality, a book is a complicated web of compromises. It's a non-linear circuit built on the uncertainty of a book's existence. There is nothing finite about a piece of literature, yet readers should know what transpired during the creation of a book to appreciate it and the business more fully. Textual historian Elizabeth Eisenstein reminds us that, quote, "When ideas are detached from the media used to transmit them, they are also cut off from the historical circumstances that shape them, and it becomes difficult to perceive the changing context within which they must be viewed," end quote. Eisenstein refers to our tendency to see the evolution of print as a linear progression toward modern print processes, rather than seeing each individual print intervention as a unique, definable revolution in its own right. She argues further that we must acknowledge, quote, "the acceptance of discontinuity," end quote, embedded in textual history. A discontinuity that frees us from understanding literature, literary history, and print culture as a chronological inevitability. Textual scholar G. Thomas Tansel describes the uncertainty inherent in literary works, much like Eisenstein's acknowledgement of discontinuity when he says, quote, "Whatever position we take regarding the independent existence of physical objects, we may still make a distinction between the works that can survive, if they survive at all, as artifacts, and works that can survive only through the instructions for their reconstruction. The former are fixed entities in a way that the latter cannot be. We have to recognize in responding to the latter that uncertainty is of their essence, and that textual questions are integral to our appreciation of them. That's like the Bible for textual editors. The uncertainty of textual objects is what drives textual editors to do what they do. It's the uncertainty that we care about. That's why we strive to find the things that we want to find. So Tansel expects us to recognize textual instability and uncertainty in order to reconstruct and properly edit a text for publication. Uncertainty helps us appreciate the complexity of texts, and the reason we are drawn to them is because of their unique ability to be multivalent rather than fixed. So bibliographer Fredson Bowers argued that, quote, a critic who becomes impatient at the bibliographer's concern to establish the exact form of a text in all its possible pre-publication states of variance is throwing away almost willfully one of the best possible ways of understanding an author by following him step by step at work. Consequently, by ignoring the textual history of a book, critics and readers ultimately lose the chance to examine, quote, the shaping development of idea as represented by stylistic and substantive revision, the manner in which one revision may have given rise to another, or to a modification of the initial concept, end quote. Tansel contends that, quote, even if one denies the idea of individual authorship altogether, in other words, the idea of the death of the author, there is no author, the reader shapes the meaning of the text. So even if that is the case, one still measures each text against the potentialities of the language in which it is expressed, and makes adjustments accordingly, end quote. He further reminds us that, quote, the process of reading and thus criticism therefore begins with the decision whether or not to be concerned with history, end quote. Tansel, along with Bowers, believes that an author's intentions should drive any edition of a work. Texts matter, especially when criticism may be based on inexact or incorrect printings of an author's work. Bowers fought for specificity, extolling the virtues of bibliography, which is the study of books as objects of commerce, as a gateway to sound criticism when he wrote, quote, the literary critic must become sophisticated and leave his childish faith in the absoluteness of the printed word. Before he expatiates upon subtle ambiguities and two-way syntax, he had better check his facts, that is to say, his text, end quote. Bowers was a bit of a curmudgeon. He was kind of an angry old white man. But he's our angry old white man. Can we truly appreciate a text if we do not know how it came into being? This is the first page of the typescript that Sara found. At the top, you'll still get to use the red thing. I feel like such a professional. At the top, you'll see Foreign Born by John Herrmann. And yet he crossed it out here. This is Foreign Born, John Herrmann. Paragraph, 6 spaces. Book 1 has been crossed out. We kept the book, we decided to keep the bookmarkers. He changed the name of the town from Benton to Fairbanks and back again. He uses different space markers, and we'll see another here. We have this we have page numbers on the top written in pencil, yet at the bottom we have them typed. We have pound signs which separate section breaks. We determined they were section breaks within a chapter. And we had to determine where the chapter breaks were, why they were there, and some of the sections we had to cobble together to make new chapters. Now, I believe we split it into 2 books. The first book is relatively short, and the second book is relatively long. So he may have had either a 3-act or a 5-act structure in mind. If you think of A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway, it's a 5-act structure. It's got 5 books. He may have been thinking that, though it wasn't written at the time that he was writing, yet the structure would have been on his mind. Yet we have 2 books. So here's just so you can peek at this while I continue talking about textual editing. So, can we truly appreciate a text? So this, if we do not know how it came into being. So bibliographic pioneer W.W. Gray felt that textual editors and bibliographers, through the, quote, patient accumulation and recording of facts, end quote. I live my life by the patient accumulation and recording of facts. I'm not very patient. The impatient accumulation and recording of facts. Should strive to ask the necessary questions regarding a text, like this. Define the problems within a text, and systematize the method by which that text is reconstructed We are dealing with a reconstruction. Or in essence, we're dealing with a construction. It's not being reconstructed. It was never constructed in the first place. So we have to construct something out of this. The concern of the bibliographer, to break, is literary. For, quote, no editor, however sure his taste, ever did valuable work without technical skill in handling textual evidence, just as no editor, however scientific, is worth his salt without taste, end quote. Minor points of difference, such as comma usage, spelling, can alter the meaning of a text. But with Herrmann's text, we are plagued with a very much and a very extremely different issue. What is the form of this book? So usually, when editing an historical document for publication, a documentary editor has the original edition of the text as a textual witness, a copy text by which all decisions can be made regarding the form, shape, style, and presentation of the text. However, Herrmann's novel only existed in the imagination as a novel. This is not a novel. This is a collection of papers that are written in sequence, that have a story, that have a narrative. He may have wanted to turn it into a novel. Yet in its form, it is not a novel. It has to be transformed into that being, right? Sarah and I disagree on some things, by the way. That's okay. I thought I'd bring it up. While we did have a textual witness, the corrected typescript in Herrmann's hand, we did determine that this is Herrmann's hand. So for the most part, all of the corrections here are Herrmann's, which helps us immensely. It wasn't some rogue editor cutting things out, right? So while we did have this witness, we were not planning on reproducing this document as it existed. We weren't going to make a facsimile of this and just put it out into the world, like, look at this thing. So therefore, we shifted from documentary editing to textual editing, in which a new document is created out of textual witnesses. We were going to make a reading edition of a text that never existed. To say that we were on shaky editorial ground, at least for me, is an understatement. I was tasked with using Herrmann's typescript, with his corrections, his emendations, and his deletions, to create a book with structure and shape, and preserve Herrmann's removed modernist style. We didn't want to damage the language. Sara will talk a little bit more about that, especially in what happens. He had in our conversations, he had two different styles. Later in his career, he lost some of that removed, what we would call a modernist style. Think of modernism like Hemingway's removed style. We wanted to preserve that here. We felt that that historical significance would matter in terms of the narrative, right? So, making books is hard. As the director of the Cornerstone Press, I tell my students that every day. Making books is hard. It's very hard. Yet, people do it. People do it a lot. We have a lot of books. And creating a new document from textual witnesses has its challenges. So I worked on this book in the summer of 2017 with a generous grant from the UWSP College of Letters and Science that allowed me to do it, assisted my endeavor. And I worked on two computer screens, as I said, with my daughter on my lap. One displayed the scans of the original corrected typescript from the Ransom Center. So Sara provided me with all of the scans, which were taken on a high-definition camera. I had no issues reading them, but I was not dealing with originals. I was dealing with scans of originals, but that's a different lecture for different time. And the other screen displayed a transcription typescript prepared by the staff at Hastings College Press. So it was replete with errors because they use a digital, I believe, right? Well, that was just student typing. Well, sometimes you can use a digital program that reads a document and produces a digital reading of it, so it's going to be really shaky. But I wasn't sure, but it looks like students at the student press at Hastings actually typed out the typescript by hand.
They did OCR with what happened.
That's why.
Student type.
Good. So now you see how many hands are involved in creating documents to begin with, right? So with these two documents, side by side, I made my way through the novel, line by line. It took me hours, days, months, paragraph by paragraph. My wife's like, are we still working on that? Constructing a novel out of multiple textual elements. Never skewing from Herrmann's voice, because when I did, Sara went like this. And only altering the text when Herrmann himself called for it. So, for instance, this is a really good example. Sara and I have talked about this a lot, and we agreed on this edit from the jump. This is fairly early on in the book, which you're going to buy, by the way, at the end of the talk. We don't get any royalties either. It all goes back to Hastings College Press, which is pretty important. Teaching press like Cornerstone Press, but at Hastings College in Nebraska. Okay? So early on, I was going through and editing, and this is a very removed book. Like, it's not very lyrical. It doesn't have a lot of like poetic language. Think like F. Scott Fitzgerald and that beautiful language. That's not here. That's not what this is. This is a different kind of writing. All of a sudden, though, whoopsie daisy, wrong thing. He has this great passage. Has anyone read The Magnificent Ambersons by Booth Tarkington? Okay. Well, it's turn of the century. It's about horse carriages turning into cars. Like the automobile was taking over the world in the Midwest, right? This Midwestern town. And there's this great section where a young man is courting a girl, and they're on a carriage, and they're riding home in the snow, and it's very romantic and beautiful. And Herrmann kind of pulls that here, but then he cuts it out. So I think I emailed Sara, and I said, okay, this is going along fine. But he's got this great passage, and he wants to get rid of it. He wants to bury it. Now, from an editorial standpoint, this is his deletion. So I should delete it and move on and forget that it ever existed. But Sara and I go back and forth and say, this kind of gives a little humanity to the text. It breaks out of that style just ever so slightly to remind you that there's some heart here. It's not just that removed, almost cold tone. So we decided to keep it, which might have been our most editorial judgment that we had to make. And I'm still over here sweating over like, oh my God. This guy's been dead since 1959, and I'm worried that he's going to come back. So here's the line in question, just so you can think what I spent weekends working on this, and very worried. So he stops with what to do about the thought. By the way, check out his handwriting. We have to learn how to read writers' handwriting, which I don't know how your handwriting is. Mine's terrible. So if anyone ever has to edit my paper someday, they're going to have a very hard time doing it, unless you're my wife. She can figure it out. Here we go. The feeling, sitting in the carriage, was not a nighttime feeling, but something more alive and real and happening to him then. It even made him wonder if he was really there at all, and if that thing was happening to him sitting there. Why should Frida, who did not seem to him attractive, she was so big and strong and manlike, make him so uneasy? It was sin to feel that way. There's something about that sentence that I feel encapsulates a lot of the work that his main character, Ernst Weimann, is feeling from the very beginning. So we didn't want to lose that. We wanted to give Herrmann a shot. We felt that if Herrmann were alive, we may have had the opportunity to convince him to hold on to that for Ernst Weimann, our main character. It might have done something really good for his character. So, before I kick back to Sara, there's another interesting sort of textual conundrum amidst all of the textual conundrums that is the text. So, by 1932, as Sara alluded to, he had won an award, tying with Thomas Wolfe, who wrote Look Homeward Angel. Anyone? Look Homeward Angel, 1932? Okay, maybe. He was starting to circulate, by 1928, he was circulating the book with a new ending. He was hoping that maybe it would place based on, well, my current ending, which we decided to stay with, because that's what the original typescript went with. We kept it that way. Was a little bit of a down. Yet, in Charlie Wyman, it has a little bit more hopeful ending. He thought, well, if I tack a more hopeful ending on to this book, maybe someone will take it. So here we were. Do we decide to take this ending and stick it on the end of that book and call it Foreign Born? We didn't have John Herrmann to ask. This was taken from the larger manuscript that he was circulating at the time of William Carlos Williams. He said, I'm going to take a chunk of this and I'm going to publish it in Contact. It is the only published piece of the manuscript that he was currently circulating to come out. But we decided, what are we going to do with it? Does it belong as part of the text as he was circulating in 1928? Or do we stay with the text that he was circulating in 1925 and 26? We eventually went with what was happening in 25 and 26. Now, before I kick over, a very quick tangent that has to do with F. Scott Fitzgerald, who's my secondary research person. So he wrote the novel Tender is the Night. Anyone? Tender is the Night? Okay. Tender is the Night is told out of sequence. It's not chronological, right? Yet, after it came out, it had middling reviews. It didn't sell very well, and he was very unhappy. So a few years in, he said, hey, here's what I want to do. I want to reorder this to go chronological, because then the readers and the critics will love me again. They needed it to be chronological. When editors edit F. Scott Fitzgerald's Tender is the Night, they dismiss that as a figment of Fitzgerald's almost anxiety about his authorship. even though the author says I want it this way, we have to determine what is the author thinking at that time to say they want it that way. Sometimes we go with what they say, sometimes we don't. And that's what editing is. And sometimes we get into trouble if we do that. But hopefully we got this one right. Okay? So, our next segue then, Sarah's going to go into a little bit more of the book and some of the context with Lansing and Michigan. We'll just circle back around and we'll make some conclusions. So,
Yeah, Ross and I went back and forth on how to sort of break some of this up and how much to tell you guys, not because we don't want to tell you about the book, we clearly want to tell you about the book, but we also would like you to theoretically, if you're interested, buy the book and read it on your own. We're going to talk a little bit about sort of why does this book matter? What did I find so interesting about it? What did Ross find so interesting about it? Why did ultimately Hastings College Press take it on? To go with those two endings just briefly to sort of pick up where Ross left off. So where the book ends originally in the typescript that I found at Texas, Ernst has been, over the course of that original novel, he goes from being in the good graces of the community where they're all loving him to going through a really tumultuous time as he decides to sort of stay loyal to his German heritage for a portion of the war. He doesn't go anti-American, but he definitely says, these are my cousins, these are my brothers, I'm not comfortable with what's happening right now, and getting sort of ostracized for that, to coming back around sort of by the end to being back in the good graces of the town, and yet still balancing that sort of pro-German and yet pro-American perspective. When you look at Charlie Wyman, the novel ends and the war is still going on. That first original typescript ends, the war is still going on. When you get to Charlie Wyman, you're post-war. You get a little bit of the war at the very beginning. Charlie is Ernst's son. He's run off. He's joined the American Army. He's fighting in World War I, or he doesn't actually quite get to fighting, but he enlists. He's about to go fight. And that's much of what you see in Charlie Wyman is the story from his perspective, with then a bit of a different spin from Ernst at the end of it. So you have sort of two spins on this kind of idea of critiquing patriotism and pro-German perspectives and nationalism and what does this all mean. And so what we decided to ultimately do, as Ross mentioned briefly, was keep the original novel as he wrote it first. And I have evidence that that was the original for the first 2-3 years it was being circulated. Keep it that way so that people could see it as it was originally created. And then we published Charlie Wyman as an appendix. So that in essence, people can look at both endings for themselves and sort of perhaps see which they prefer or what they think might have driven him to sort of finish it one way as opposed to another. So in the edition that's out, I actually think that was a really smart move on our part because I like that idea of leaving it to people to see sort of what we see and to piece things together sort of as they want to. And Ross didn't mention this, but he got stuck editing Charlie Wyman a little bit too because minor editing, but something published in the 1930s had some grammatical errors and whatever, and poor Ross got stuck pouring through that as well. So. But some of the details that come out, the interesting thing about Foreign Born in particular, and I didn't know this during my first read through, but it became apparent very quickly as I started doing research. The wonderful thing in today's day and age, I don't know how many of you have checked out databases like newspapers.com, but it is revolutionizing historical knowledge and literary scholarship and a whole bunch of other things because now a lot of newspapers are all digitized and searchable online. So instead of having to pore over things, microfilm, ideally for hours and hours on end, hoping that you'd find the article that led to whatever the thing was that you're trying to research, now you can type it into a search bar and it largely comes up, or at least you get much closer sort of to being able to sort of locate things. So a lot of sort of what I ended up finding here even is sort of via newspapers.com and databases like that. But some of what comes up in the novel. So initially, Lansing has one of the oldest Liederkranz singing societies in the country, German singing societies in the country, still active today. In the novel, Ernst is hanging out at the Liederkranz Society early on, and everybody's having a grand old time until the war starts. And then everybody doesn't want to necessarily say they're German anymore because everybody is being very sort of anti-German in the community, and they're very making accusations, quite unfounded most of the time, about people being German spies. accusing people that if they're pro-German, they're anti-American. And what happens in the novel parallels what actually happened in Lansing, which is that by 1919, this incredibly prosperous organization ended up selling its hall and basically shuttering its doors. Until 1921, when all of a sudden, post-war, things are kind of getting rosier again. And there's an article in the Lansing State Journal that there was a 200-person reunion of the Liederkranz Society. So that you can see very precipitously, even though they never say that they closed their doors because it was the anti-German sentiment and because of the atmosphere, all of the articles are just, well, you know, people don't want to hang out there anymore. It's very sort of veiled. But then all of a sudden you're like, well, wait, 2 years later though, like you can get 200 people in town together to hang out and celebrate this. So that ends up becoming one of the things that's also woven into the story. Ernst both participates in the Liederkranz Hall early on, you know, witnesses the sale within the book, very much parallels some of the real world stuff happening at the time. Lansing, Michigan also had an incredibly active vigilance society or vigilance committee. These actually happened all over the country at the time, depending on how much you know about sort of that contextual history. But a lot of ordinary citizens empowered themselves to basically root out German spies and to make sure that everyone was supporting the war effort and buying war bonds. This is a headline from November 3rd, 1917 in the Lansing State Journal that gives a sense of some of what's happening in the community in terms of that. In particular, I know you can't read it, but you know, the context of it at least appearing. Up at the top there, they start printing names of people who don't buy war bonds. So you were publicly shamed in the newspaper. The list here I found particularly a little bit chilling in today's day and age, in that the people on the committee were proud of their work enough to sign that they were doing this and that they were tracking these people down and holding them accountable. And if you know enough about Lansing, Michigan itself, most of the names on here were incredibly prominent people in the community. So in the novel itself, Ernst experiences people who are members of the Vigilance Committee coming to his store, telling him he's not buying enough war bonds. There's a lot of sort of hostility within the community and fear in the community based around these activities. So clearly, John Herrmann was pulling off of real-world events to sort of create that text. In particular, a very prominent case, or very prominent sort of incident comes up in the novel. What's the date on it? Friday, November 2nd, 1917, William Sayer, a known Lansing butcher, he had owned a butcher shop in town, was taken out to the golf links and tarred and feathered for making a bestial insult on the American flag. None of the newspaper accounts specify exactly what he did. In the novel, Herrmann mentions that he has peed on the flag. And it's a fictionalized William Sayer in the novel. In the novel, his name is Wilhelm Meisel. But it's an actual situation that happened. It's interesting because the novel actually sort of adds background context in a way the newspaper articles don't, because it's clear Herrmann knew about the actual history and about the actual moment. Whether it was through hearsay in the community, whether it was because he knew the Sayer family, that I couldn't say specifically, but he is so spot on with his depiction of it in the novel that it matches the newspaper accounts almost exactly. It's also interesting because in this moment you see things that are sort of historically interesting in that out at the golf links, as he's being tarred and feathered, multiple newspaper accounts mention that it's by white hooded figures. And the Ku Klux Klan is clearly in operation already, but this definitely is sort of precedes sort of the buildup of that in the mid-20th century. So you see sort of parallels to that. There's also a lot of sort of intrigue in that the local newspaper seemed to know about it before it happened. It's mentioned in the novel. It's not mentioned as much in the newspaper stories, although there is a mention that there's a special edition of the Lansing State Journal that covers this, and I can't find a copy of it anywhere. And I'm kind of thinking that either a lot of those copies got destroyed or they weren't widely circulated, but it also sort of adds to the mystery and the intrigue. But again, where he's pulling from real world sort of moments and real actual history to sort of build this fictional story. So the text really becomes sort of an interesting sort of artifact, both of a literary sort of style and a literary time, but also of a very historical time. It is the only novel that deals with anti-German sentiment on the US home front. You get tiny bits of it in things like Sinclair Lewis's Main Street, a couple of scenes. Willa Cather's One of Ours, a couple of scenes. You have major writers of the time who are working it into some of their stories in sort of momentary ways. This is the only novel that anyone I've ever spoken to is aware of that actually spends an entire novel sort of delving into what the experience may have been like, what the history was like, what sort of that time was like. There's a few other things that come up as well. In terms of, there's references to the American Protective League, which was sort of in essence an offshoot or a sort of companion of those vigilance committees. There's references to some of the publications of the time, like the Fatherland or the American Monthly, that were very pro-German publications. Ernst is reading those. So you get all of these ways that sort of history and real life are being sort of woven together, and fictional sort of perspectives are being woven together in this novel. So this is where I kick it back to you for a minute. Yeah. So Ross is going to talk for a minute about why he thinks ultimately this is important, and I'm going to follow up with a couple of words, and then we're going to kick it to you guys for questions.
Yeah. Pretty smooth. Pretty smooth transition. All right. So, I feel like my role in bringing Herrmann's novel to life at the first time is an important part of literary and cultural study. My chief research figures, again, are Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, two major writers who have been studied and written about for decades. I'm also interested in editorial ethics, publishing history and bibliography, and the profession of authorship in America. I am extremely lucky to teach courses in these fields at this university. They don't teach these courses at Madison. They don't teach these courses at Milwaukee. They don't teach these courses at any state school. These are graduate school topics. These are only for graduate students. My students who sit in the back over there, they get these topics. They get them full, all the barrels. And they do really well, because these topics are really important, especially when it comes to studying literature in our country. So, however, my training at Kent State University in Ohio taught me to examine underappreciated writers along with those major writers that I've spoken. Forgotten craftspeople and neglected artists. In fact, two of the writers in my dissertation, Ring Lardner, you might have heard of Ring Lardner, he's a baseball writer. He's a great short story writer. And James Gould Cousins, anybody? I never get anybody for Cousins. Cousins is my John Herrmann. That's my John Herrmann. It's James Gould Cousins, a mid-century writer. He had the best-selling novel that took over for the novel Peyton Place by Grace Metalius. Anybody? Peyton Place? The novel that supplanted it on the #1 bestseller list was James Gould Cousins by Love Possessed. Got it. I read that book. All 670 pages. It takes place over 3 days. It's a long day. It is my obligation, and that word is not something I think about, it's my obligation as a scholar and as a humanist to resurrect voices of the past. And maybe that is my greatest achievement working on Foreign Born with Sara. We have a responsibility, not only as scholars and teachers, but as human beings, to properly document the narratives of those who came before us. Without deep and sustained study of the humanities disciplines, the very lifeblood of our collective consciousness begins to erode. We need to know how the past felt, how it spoke, how it loved, and how it died. Without our humanity and without our stories, we as a people remain incomplete. And Herrmann's book is far from complete, since he never published the book as we know it in his lifetime. But as an historical document, prepared for a reading public by scholars that care, the book fills a gap, as Sara has mentioned, in the fictional narratives of the home front during the Great War, whose centenary we just celebrated. So when I consider the ethical implications of publishing foreign born, I'm fraught with doubt, as any good editor should be. Should we have simply facsimilated the existing typescript and printed it as an historical artifact? Should we have done a diplomatic transcription, whereby every change to the typescript would be visible to the reader? We chose to produce a reading text because the only way to resurrect a forgotten author, as Sara knows, is to get their work back into print. In doing so, we give readers a chance to experience Herrmann's narrative of paranoia and nationalism as it exists, not as it was meant to be. Because you see, there is no meant to be with Foreign Born. The book I hold in my hand is a wonderful anomaly. An edited reading text built from a corrected typescript without authorial consent. However, my doubts and my editorial guilt have been assuaged by the success of the finished product. John Herrmann would have been pleased that a scrappy group of Midwestern scholars decided to dig into his papers in Texas, of all places, and publish what could have been a corker of a novel in his time. I like that word, corker. We gotta use it more often. Good job. I'm honored to be involved in this kind of reclamation. For voices long forgotten require careful, patient excavation if they are meant to live again amongst more established American Great War writers, like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Willa Cather, and John Dos Passos. I believe that Herrmann's Ernst Weiner, a German-American swept up in the fog of war at home, belongs in the conversation with Hemingway's Frederick Henry, Cather's Claude Wheeler, and Fitzgerald's Dick Dyer. My dream for Foreign Born is for it to be read, plain and simple, since there is no greater accomplishment for an editor than to see the fruits of their labor discussed, analyzed, and respected in service to their subject. So that's all I have.
I have just something briefly. I know, you're all waiting and going, how much longer are they going to talk?
Sarah will conclude.
So just briefly, my introduction to the novel starts with this quote, which is, I know, a little bit lengthy. But about the time I was sort of looking into this idea of anti-German sentiment, I also read a book by Ludwig Louison called Upstream: An American Chronicle. He was a German immigrant as a child. I think he came here about the age of 8. He's writing Upstream: An American Chronicle in 1922 about the anti-Jewish, anti-German attitudes that he experienced in the late 19th, early 20, or late 1910s, sort of early 1920s. He was a German professor who couldn't get a job because he was Jewish and German, and experienced a lot of sort of issues along that lines. But the interesting thing about Foreign Born, the interesting thing about this time period, and the uncanny ways it resonates today in ways that I wish it didn't, sort of tie into this quote. Americanization means, of course, assimilation. But that's an empty concept, a mere cry of rage or tyranny, until the question is answered, which would never be asked, were the answer ripe. Assimilation to what? To what homogenous culture, to what folkways of festival and song, to what common instincts concerning love and beauty, to what imaginative passions, to what roads of thought. And so the calls for 100% Americanism in the novel, the critique of sort of patriotism as opposed to nationalism, the notion of where should our loyalties lie, where do they need to lie, how do we prove our loyalties, are all over this text, and I think very interestingly parallel some of the conversations that we're even having today, sort of in knowing where those are measured. So thank you all for listening and for being a lovely audience and listening to us yammer on, and hopefully that made some sense, and we're happy to answer questions.
You didn't get the author's consent, but did you have to get consent from anybody to do this?
Theoretically, yes. There's copyright. And even dead authors still have copyright, or at least usually someone generally holds copyright. You can will it. I will have to say, I'll say quite honestly, we have basically done what in copyright law is considered good faith effort. I know his second wife is dead. I know his son is dead. I looked to the US Copyright Law Office, especially for what happens, which still may be under French copyrights. We may be skirting the law there, but French copyright generally being more generous than US copyright. But there's no heirs we can find. And in fact, I'm in touch with a few family members who don't even know how you would track somebody down. It's an orphaned text, basically. Yeah, so there wasn't, had we done this 30 years ago, there probably would have been more people still alive. I have half joked that I timed dead authors, you want dead authors and sort of dead ancestors. I mean, like, that's the sweet spot. Just because you don't have to, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of negotiation. I mean, Ross and I both work on Ernest Hemingway. The Hemingway estate is a ridiculously complex behemoth of, yeah, heirs and copyrights, and people have gotten different rights to different things, and yeah.
Hemingway brand is pretty hot.
Yeah, But also, I mean, the literal notion of who has what right. I mean, the Hemingway Foundation has rights to some things, the Hemingway family has rights to other things, and who in the Hemingway family's control. Yeah, I mean, it's a nightmare sometimes otherwise. So. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. What would you like to ask?
So I'm interested in part of what you said in your presentation about sort of allowing an author to speak, or the editor's role in allowing an author to speak when you're dealing with text on paper and not what you and I do down the hall, right? And so thinking about someone like Tangedal, who's going to say you can't really tell what an author meant when they use a word that's sort of out of fashion or out of use, out of circulation, right? And so I'm wondering if you encountered in your either one of you in your sort of movement from this from a historical document to a book, when you were making these decisions, was he using German language that was difficult to translate? Was he using idioms or idiosyncratic language at the time that had no real way to make it sort of seem relevant to a modern reader's working? Like, how did you deal with those sorts of problems?
I can take the first jump. If you got to think too. So the key there, though, with this isn't documentary editing. So documentary editing is just taking something and reproducing with annotations, providing context, but showing you the original piece, right? This was textual editing, so there was some decision making into what goes where and why, right? Okay. So the first thing is you have to take. In this case, we didn't necessarily have a copy text. We had kind of a guiding text. We used what happens as a guide for the language. So when Sara originally edited and introduced and brought us what happens a few years ago, she had laid the groundwork for how we considered Herrmann's early style, what it looked like, what it sounded like, and what words he would use. Now we tried to preserve, as editors will, they will attempt to preserve the context of that moment in language, right? So the point is not to modernize the language for the sake of modernization. It's to understand. What Bowers would say is that an editor, certainly a textual editor's job, is to know the author's working habits and language better than the author himself. Therefore, when they are reconstructing a text for publication, they can somehow conjure as best they can, it's not possible, but as best they can, what an author would say at a given point, right? So I would argue that we kept that context purposefully, those idioms, those idiosyncratic, and there's plenty of them. He spells pro-German, P-R-O. P-R-O, no space, big G, E-R-M-A-N.
Which I made us keep and drove across.
We went back and forth like, why? It's idiosyncrasy, right? And so, but you raise a good question, which might be another topic for another day. What idiosyncrasies do you keep? Which do you say, oops, you made a mistake, we got to correct? An editor's job is to edit, so we have to make decisions on what those things are, right?
Yeah, I'm with Ross. I don't know that we got it 100% right. I did fight for certain things. The using what happens as a model was a little bit convenient in the sense that that was published during his lifetime. He saw the final product. I don't know how much he had to do with the actual editing of it. In fact, I'm knowing Robert McAlmon, who was the publisher of it. What Happens was published by Contact Editions, the same press that published Ernest Hemingway's first book, Gertrude Stein, a whole bunch of those sort of modernist writers. McAlmon didn't edit. McAlmon just wanted to publish books. So all assumptions are basically that it went probably from manuscript straight to what McAlmon created. And then you have the question, because it was a French printer, were there some idiosyncrasies added because it was a French printer and not a US printer, and the printer didn't know English. But we did keep a few idiosyncrasies that I fought for. Herrmann tended to write high school as one word, and that's how it appeared in the printed version of What Happens. I fought for that to stay into Foreign Born. I mean, it was only written, like I said, maybe 6 to 8 months later. So I felt that would have been, and it was in there are at least suggestions. Occasionally it was 2 words, and then it had the penciled where he wanted it to be one again. Right. I fought to keep pro-German one word because it's that way all the way throughout. But there were things that we made choices on. I was looking, we didn't keep shoe store one word. He wants shoe store to be one word. There's places where you can see, and in fact on one of the slides today, that's part of why I noticed it again, where he penciled it, he wanted it one word, and we chose to make that 2. I don't know that we got it perfectly right. It was an attempt to keep it someplace between readable for modern readers and enough idiosyncrasies to keep the style of the original. And it's, the lovely thing about research is in 20 years, somebody else will come back to that typescript and be like, who were these clowns that published that text? Like, it should have totally done it this way. because that seems to be what literary studies does a little bit, is continues to sort of try to revise and fine tune and sort of build on those experiences.
Sentence breaks were big for us too. There's a lot of run-on sentences.
Yeah,
And
a lot
but
of
we-
commas.
But we made some choices on, do we preserve every single run-on sentence in its modernism?
Yeah.
Or do we make some changes to allow for breaks in pacing and rhythm? So again, it's a lot of choices. An editor's job is to edit. Other questions? About anything? We're here. Yeah.
I'm willing to wait. I don't know how. I'm fascinated. So I'm wondering that in the context of your editing and those decisions that you made, which you had mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, not only his sort of intersection with the lives of some of these really well-known authors, writers who have shaped sort of the American idea in a lot of ways, and he seems not to have been able to sort of reach that. I think you mentioned that his star didn't really rise. Do you find that a problem with his voice or his narrative, or just, I mean, because there are writers who are impoverished and manage to produce gold, even though they don't really get it during their lifetime, right?
Sure.
And so I wonder if, like, how you see, like, what sort of derailed his scholar's rise.
We chatted about this earlier today. It's a very good question, because we both agree, obviously we worked on the book, we think it's a pretty fair book. I mean, if it would have been developed more in its time with the author, it may have been a very well-respected, critically acclaimed book. Like, we talk about war books all the time, Farewell to Arms, and things of that nature, but, you know, this could have been a homefront war novel, which would be a very unique experience, and it is today. I mean, this is 1925, 26. War's been over since 18. You don't want to print World War I novel. Thomas Boyd got that. Thomas Boyd wrote the novel Through the Wheat and a short story collection, Points of Honor. I just got done writing a review for Points of Honor, a short story collection.
Got republished.
What's that?
Both have been just
Correct.
reissued.
Reissued for the same reason, because they told Boyd, that ain't gonna sell. We don't need no more World War I books. We gotta move on, which is funny because Hemingway's Farewell to Arms published 1929, some 11 years after the war, and that brought it all back, right? So we believe partially that, well, at that time, 25, 26, publishers, and there is a reader's report at the end of this, which was another piece of trivia that we were thinking about adding in tonight. But the fact that they wouldn't want to print not only not a World War I novel, but a World War I homefront novel about German anti-German sentiment, they are now our friends, they are now our neighbors, we can't go writing novels and printing novels about anti-German American sentiment.
I mean, as Ross said, there's actually a few readers' reports for this novel. It's, I think, the only one I have that much material on. So he made the rounds of almost every major New York publisher of the time. Most of them said that there was some good content in it. Most of them said it's not going to be profitable for us to publish. They didn't think there would be sales. So I think some of them would have been willing to work with him on the stylistics, but they just said nobody's going to, we're not going to get enough sales off this to make it profitable. A few said it can maybe be made profitable with changes. Unfortunately, I don't have that letter. That's the frustrating part about archival research too, where somebody's like, oh, well, we'll publish this if, and then you're like, but if what? Like, so I don't have that, but he also, it's well documented in the letters, he hated revision. And so he would write to somebody saying, well, I'm trying to think of the publisher for that one. But he was like, oh, well, they said they'd take it, but I don't want to have to rewrite. So, laziness factored in a little bit too, in addition to poverty. Yeah, that's a bit of it too. But that's what's interesting though, because I'm clearly a little bit biased as his biographer, but it's what also, sort of brought me into this. There's glimmers of things that are interesting. I mean, I've said in other talks, I don't think he's a lost Shakespeare or anything. I'm not selling him that way. It's not like, oh my gosh, this is the greatest text ever written and nobody's discovered it. But it is interesting, and particularly in an American context, both for sort of its moment in, what happens was too, for its moment in American literature and what's happening, for its moment in American history and what's happening. Those are really his values, is sort of needling some of that stuff in a way I don't see other people doing.
Well, when Boyd was told, when Boyd was told by publishers, oh, we're not going to publish World War I novels, he goes, well, they're not going to sell, he goes, I respectfully disagree with you. He was a combat Marine, so he was writing about, I respectfully disagree with you about the prospects of these books, but sorry. Okay.
Is there a particular area of the United States that he's depicting the anti-German son?
This novel's entirely in Michigan. Takes place entirely in Michigan, so that's largely his focus. Although the things that are happening there were happening throughout the country. So, there's definitely parallels. Some places, I think, had more active vigilance committees, for example, than others, but it's happening throughout the United States.
Is it a smaller community in Michigan?
Lansing's the state capital. Yeah, no, it's quite okay.
Based on Lansing, right?
It's based on Lansing. He calls it Fairbanks, but it's based on Lansing. Yeah.
We got cued from Young, so but we'd love to continue.
Yeah.
So we just want to officially bring it to a close. And if you'd like to continue chatting with us, she's staying with me, and we live over the bridge. So happy to chat with you. We've got books for sale. Again, we don't take any royalties.
Yeah.
It's all goes to the
It's a
press.
student project press, much like
press.
Cornerstone Press. So we're not trying to tell you you have to buy one just out of sympathy for the poor students,
know-
but it's the students. So
I brought 2 pens. Sarah and I will both sign them. But no, but really, if you're interested in the book, there's plenty for sale. Check out Hastings College Press online. They do a lot of
Portage
great
County
work.
Public Library will be closing in 20 minutes.
Just 20 more minutes. Hastings College Press does reclaim Midwestern and regional texts. Books by Will Cather, books by a whole bunch of different writers.
Zona Gale,
Eleanor.
Miss Lulu Bett,
Thank you. Yeah, just a little bit. Eleanor Porter Stratton, right?
Jean
Stratton Porter. Yeah. So anyway, we'll continue discussion, but we have to officially bring to close.